From casseroles to paprikash, Grandma always knew how to give new life to boring ground beef. Her dishes were always spot on, ready to give you the time of your life at lunch. Allow me to let you in on her cooking secrets. Classic 1950s meatloaf. Every Sunday, without fail, Grandma would pull out her metal loaf pan and work her hands through a mixture that seemed almost sacred. This wasn't just any meatloaf. This was the kind that held families together around dinner tables. She'd combine 2 pounds of ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, 2 beaten eggs, and finely diced onions that she'd cry over while chopping. The secret wasn't in expensive ingredients, but in the way she'd gently fold everything together, never overworking the meat. A glaze of ketchup mixed with brown sugar and a dash of Worcestershire sauce would paint the top, creating that glossy finish that made mouths water from 3 rooms away. The meatloaf would bake low and slow, filling the house with an aroma that meant home. Served alongside mashed potatoes and green beans, this dish represented more than dinner. It was love made edible, comfort served on a platter. But before we move next, if you love nostalgia and classic comfort foods from the past, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because I share timeless food memories that you won't want to miss. All right, let's get started. Chili con carne. Nothing said welcome home quite like walking into Grandma's kitchen and smelling her chili con carne bubbling away on the back burner. This wasn't some fancy chef creation. This was the kind of chili that could warm you from the inside out on the coldest winter day. She'd brown the ground beef in her biggest pot, letting it develop those deep, rich flavors before adding onions that would cook until they practically melted into sweetness. The spices came next. Chili powder that she'd buy by the canister, cumin that smelled like earth and sunshine, and just enough cayenne to give it a gentle kick. Canned tomatoes would go in whole, and she'd crush them with her wooden spoon right in the pot, letting their juices mingle with everything else. Kidney beans, sometimes pintos too, would add substance and make the chili stretch to feed however many mouths showed up at dinner time. Hours of slow simmering would transform these simple ingredients into something magical. A chili so rich and complex you'd swear it contained secret ingredients. Served with cornbread for dipping and maybe a dollop of sour cream, this chili was more than a meal. It was a warm hug in a bowl. Tamale pie. Grandma's tamale pie was her nod to Southwestern flavors, transformed into something that could feed the whole family from a single casserole dish. This wasn't authentic Mexican food. It was American comfort food, inspired by south-of-the-border tastes. The base started with ground beef browned with onions and seasoned with chili powder, cumin, and a touch of paprika that gave everything a warm, earthy flavor. Canned corn and diced tomatoes would join the party, along with kidney beans for extra heartiness. The whole mixture would simmer until the flavors married together in perfect harmony. But the real star of this show was the cornbread topping. A simple batter made from cornmeal, flour, eggs, and milk that would spread over the beef mixture like a golden blanket. As it baked, that cornbread would puff and brown, creating a crust that was crispy on top and tender underneath. Each serving delivered a complete meal in every bite. Protein, vegetables, and bread all layered together in a way that made sense to both the stomach and the budget. Beef and rice casserole. Grandma's beef and rice casserole was the ultimate one-dish meal, designed to feed the family while using ingredients that were always available in her pantry. This wasn't complicated cooking. This was smart cooking, the kind that understood that sometimes the best meals come from letting simple ingredients work together in perfect harmony. Ground beef would brown with onions in her skillet, creating the flavorful base that would anchor the entire dish. Raw rice would get stirred right into the beef mixture, along with beef broth that would provide all the liquid the rice needed to cook perfectly. Frozen mixed vegetables would add color and nutrition without requiring any prep work, making this the kind of meal that could come together even on the busiest weeknight. Everything would go into a casserole dish, covered tightly with foil, and baked until the rice was tender and had absorbed all those wonderful flavors. The result was a complete meal in every serving. Protein, vegetables, and starch all cooked together until they became something greater than the sum of their parts. This casserole proved that Grandma understood the secret to satisfying family meals. Keep it simple, keep it delicious, and always make enough for leftovers. Salisbury steak. When times were tight but spirits needed lifting, Grandma would transform ordinary ground beef into something that felt fancy enough for Sunday best. Salisbury steak was her answer to making Hamburger feel like a restaurant meal. She'd shape the seasoned beef into oval patties, browning them perfectly in a heavy skillet until they developed that beautiful crust. The real magic happened next, a rich mushroom gravy that would simmer and bubble around those patties, creating a sauce so good you'd want to drink it. Made from the pan drippings, beef broth, and sliced mushrooms that had been cooked until golden, this gravy was liquid gold. The steaks would nestle back into that bubbling goodness, absorbing all those flavors while staying tender and juicy. Served over a mountain of creamy mashed potatoes with the gravy cascading down the sides, this meal could make any day feel special. It was proof that Grandma could take the humblest ingredients and create something extraordinary. Hamburger casserole. The beauty of Grandma's hamburger casserole lay in its simplicity and the way it could feed an army without breaking the bank. This one-dish wonder started with browning ground beef with onions until the kitchen filled with that familiar, comforting smell. Into the same pan would go canned corn, diced tomatoes, and a packet of seasoning that somehow made everything taste like it had been simmering all day. The mixture would get topped with a layer of instant mashed potatoes, spread smooth as frosting on a cake, then sprinkled with shredded cheese that would melt into golden bubbles. 45 minutes in the oven was all it took to create a complete meal that satisfied both hunger and soul. This wasn't just food, it was strategy. Grandma knew that this casserole would provide leftovers for days, ensuring no one went hungry even when money was scarce. Each forkful delivered protein, vegetables, and carbs all in one bite, making it the perfect example of practical cooking that never sacrificed taste. Hamburger chow mein casserole. When Grandma wanted to add a little adventure to the dinner table without venturing too far from familiar territory, she'd whip up her hamburger chow mein casserole. This dish represented the 1950s fascination with international flavors, adapted to suit American tastes and budgets. Ground beef would sizzle alongside diced celery and onions, creating a base that smelled like comfort and possibility. Canned chow mein noodles, those crispy golden tangles that came in a can, would get mixed right in, along with cream of mushroom soup and a splash of soy sauce. The whole mixture would go into a casserole dish, topped with more of those crunchy noodles, and slid into the oven until bubbly. The result was a fusion dish that satisfied the family's desire for something different, while still feeling like home. Each bite offered textures that played together. The tender beef, creamy sauce, and those satisfying crunchy noodles that somehow stayed crisp even after baking. It was Grandma's way of bringing the world to her dinner table without leaving her kitchen. Beef and noodle casserole. When Grandma needed to make dinner happen fast, but still wanted something that felt special, her beef and noodle casserole was the answer. This dish proved that sometimes the simplest combinations create the most satisfying results. Wide egg noodles would go into boiling salted water, while ground beef browned alongside diced onions in her trusty skillet. The smell alone was enough to draw family members into the kitchen, drawn by that combination of browning meat and sautéing onions that meant good things were coming. Once the beef was perfectly browned and the onions tender, cream of mushroom soup would join the party, along with a splash of milk to make everything creamy and rich. The cooked noodles would get stirred right in, along with frozen peas that would add color and a touch of sweetness. Into a buttered casserole dish it would go, topped with breadcrumbs mixed with melted butter that would bake into a golden, crunchy crown. 30 minutes in the oven was all it took to transform these humble ingredients into a casserole that could satisfy the hungriest teenagers and leave them asking for seconds. Beef and cabbage skillet. When fresh vegetables were expensive but cabbage was cheap, Grandma knew exactly how to turn this humble vegetable into something that would make the whole family forget they were eating their vegetables. Her beef and cabbage skillet was a masterclass in making simple ingredients sing together in perfect harmony. Ground beef would start browning in her cast iron skillet while she shredded cabbage into ribbons that looked almost too pretty to cook. The beef would get pushed to one side of the skillet while diced onions cooked in the rendered fat, becoming golden and sweet. Then came the cabbage, piled high in the skillet until it seemed impossible that it would all fit. But Grandma knew that cabbage had a magic trick. It would wilt and shrink as it cooked, concentrating all its mild, sweet flavor into tender leaves that absorbed all the beefy goodness from the skillet. Salt, pepper, and a touch of paprika were all the seasoning this dish needed, letting the natural flavors of the beef and cabbage shine through. Served over rice or with crusty bread, this skillet meal was proof that the simplest combinations often create the most satisfying results. Cabbage rolls with ground beef. Making cabbage rolls was an all-afternoon affair in Grandma's kitchen, but the results were worth every minute of careful preparation. This dish represented the pinnacle of Grandma's cooking skills, the ability to take inexpensive ingredients and transform them into something that looked and tasted like it belonged at a fancy dinner party. Whole cabbage heads would get boiled until the leaves could be carefully peeled away, each one handled like precious silk. The filling was a masterpiece of simplicity: ground beef mixed with cooked rice, diced onions, and just enough seasoning to let each flavor shine through. Each cabbage leaf would get a small mound of filling before being rolled up like a tiny present, the edges tucked in perfectly to prevent any filling from escaping. The rolls would nestle together in a heavy pot, covered with a sauce made from canned tomatoes, a touch of brown sugar, and enough beef broth to keep everything moist during the long, slow cooking process. Hours of gentle simmering would transform these simple rolls into something magical. Tender cabbage surrounding savory filling, all bathed in a rich, flavorful sauce that was perfect for sopping up with crusty bread. Beef Wellington-style loaf. When Grandma wanted to make ground beef feel fancy enough for special occasions, her beef Wellington-style loaf was the perfect solution. This wasn't traditional beef Wellington. This was Grandma's interpretation, designed to deliver impressive results without the intimidation factor of the original. Ground beef would get mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and sautéed mushrooms and onions that had been cooked until golden and fragrant. The mixture would get shaped into a loaf, but instead of going directly into a loaf pan, it would get wrapped in puff pastry that had been rolled thin and brushed with egg wash. The pastry would create a golden, flaky crust that made the humble meatloaf look like something from a fancy restaurant. As it baked, the pastry would puff and brown while the meatloaf cooked to perfection inside, creating a dish that was both familiar and exciting. Each slice revealed the beautiful contrast between the crispy pastry exterior and the tender, flavorful meat inside. Served with roasted vegetables and maybe some of that pan gravy, this dish proved that Grandma could take any ingredient and make it feel special enough for Sunday dinner. Beef and potato patties. When Grandma had leftover mashed potatoes and needed to stretch a small amount of ground beef into something substantial, her beef and potato patties were pure genius. These weren't just regular patties. They were a masterclass in making ingredients work harder than they had any right to. Cold mashed potatoes would get mixed with raw ground beef, creating a mixture that was part familiar, part surprising. Diced onions would add flavor and texture, while eggs would bind everything together into patties that held their shape beautifully. Each patty would get a light coating of flour before hitting the hot skillet, where they'd develop a golden crust that gave way to a tender, flavorful interior. The combination of beef and potatoes created a texture that was both hearty and comforting, with each bite delivering protein and carbs in perfect harmony. Served with green beans or corn and maybe a dollop of ketchup on the side, these patties turned leftovers into a completely new meal. They proved that Grandma's creativity could transform yesterday's dinner into today's delicious solution, making sure nothing ever went to waste in her kitchen. Beef and macaroni skillet. One pot, 30 minutes, and a handful of pantry staples. That's all Grandma needed to create her beef and macaroni skillet that could feed the whole family and leave everyone asking for seconds. This wasn't gourmet cooking. This was smart cooking, the kind that understood that sometimes the best meals come from the simplest methods. Ground beef would start browning in her biggest skillet, while water came to a boil in another pot for the macaroni. The timing was everything. By the time the beef was perfectly browned and the onions were tender, the macaroni would be ready to drain and add to the skillet. Canned diced tomatoes would join the party, along with enough seasonings to make everything taste like it had been simmering for hours. The pasta would absorb all those flavors while finishing its cooking in the skillet, creating a dish where every element was perfectly integrated. Cheese would get stirred in at the end, melting into strings of golden goodness that made each forkful irresistible. This skillet meal proved that Grandma understood something important about cooking, that the best comfort food comes from making simple ingredients work together in perfect harmony. Sloppy Joe. Every kid in the neighborhood knew that when Grandma was making sloppy joes, they'd better show up hungry and ready to get messy. These weren't just sandwiches. They were an experience, a delicious disaster waiting to happen on soft hamburger buns. Ground beef would brown in her biggest skillet while she diced onions and green peppers that would add crunch and flavor to every bite. The vegetables would cook until just tender, then ketchup, mustard, and brown sugar would join the mix, creating a sauce that was sweet, tangy, and absolutely irresistible. A splash of Worcestershire sauce added depth, while a dash of hot sauce provided just enough heat to keep things interesting. The mixture would simmer until it reached that perfect consistency, saucy enough to be messy, but thick enough to stay on the bun. Served on toasted hamburger buns with a pile of napkins on the side, these sloppy joes were the kind of meal that brought out the kid in everyone. Each bite was a perfect balance of sweet and savory, messy and satisfying, proving that sometimes the best meals are the ones that require you to abandon all pretense and just dig in. Scalloped beef. Grandma's scalloped beef was her answer to making ground beef feel elegant and special, even when the budget was tight. This dish proved that with the right technique, humble ingredients could create something that looked and tasted like Sunday dinner every night of the week. Thin slices of potatoes would get layered in a buttered casserole dish like overlapping roof shingles, each layer seasoned with salt and pepper. Ground beef, browned with onions until fragrant and perfectly cooked, would get spread over the potatoes like a savory blanket. More potato slices would go on top, creating layers that would cook together into something greater than the sum of their parts. The magic happened when Grandma would pour hot milk mixed with flour over the whole thing, creating a sauce that would seep down between the layers and bind everything together. As it baked, the top would brown and bubble, while the milk mixture transformed into a creamy sauce that kept the potatoes tender and infused every layer with rich, comforting flavor. Each serving revealed beautiful layers of potatoes and beef, proving that Grandma could make the simplest ingredients look like a work of art. Meatball casserole. When Grandma wanted to make meatballs, but didn't have time to stand over the stove, rolling and frying dozens of individual spheres, her meatball casserole was the perfect solution. This dish delivered all the comfort of traditional meatballs and gravy, but with half the work and twice the satisfaction. Ground beef would get mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and finely minced onions, then shaped into meatballs about the size of walnuts. But instead of frying them, these meatballs would go directly into a casserole dish where they'd be surrounded by egg noodles and covered with a mixture of cream of mushroom soup, beef broth, and frozen peas. The whole thing would get topped with buttered breadcrumbs and baked until the meatballs were cooked through and the noodles were tender. What emerged from the oven was pure comfort food. Tender meatballs nestled in creamy noodles, with peas adding color and sweetness to every bite. The breadcrumb topping provided texture contrast, creating a dish that was both familiar and exciting. This casserole proved that sometimes the best solutions come from thinking outside the traditional cooking methods and finding new ways to achieve the same delicious results. Beef and biscuit bake. Nothing quite compared to the drama of Grandma's beef and biscuit bake emerging from the oven, with golden biscuits perched on top of a bubbling beef mixture like fluffy clouds floating over a savory landscape. This dish was part stew, part bread, and completely satisfying. Ground beef would start the show, browning with onions and carrots that added sweetness and color to the mix. Frozen mixed vegetables would join the party, along with enough beef broth to create a gravy-like consistency that would bubble and simmer while the flavors melded together. The mixture would go into a deep casserole dish, creating the foundation for the real stars of this show. Drop biscuits made from scratch with flour, baking powder, and enough buttermilk to create dough that would puff into golden perfection. Spoonfuls of biscuit dough would get dropped right on top of the hot beef mixture, where they'd bake into fluffy, buttery biscuits that absorbed all the savory flavors from below. Each serving delivered a complete meal: protein, vegetables, and bread, all baked together into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. Beef porcupine meatballs. The name alone was enough to make kids giggle, but Grandma's beef porcupine meatballs were serious business when it came to stretching ground beef into a filling family meal. These weren't your ordinary meatballs. They had a secret ingredient that made them special and gave them their distinctive name. Uncooked rice would get mixed right into the ground beef along with eggs, onions, and seasonings, creating meatballs that looked a bit prickly, thanks to the rice poking out like tiny quills. The magic happened during cooking, when the rice would absorb liquid and expand, making each meatball tender and stretching the meat further than anyone thought possible. These special meatballs would simmer in a tomato-based sauce that provided all the moisture the rice needed to cook perfectly. As they cooked, the meatballs would plump up and the rice would become tender, creating a texture that was both familiar and surprising. Served over mashed potatoes or rice with plenty of that rich tomato sauce, these porcupine meatballs proved that Grandma's creativity knew no bounds when it came to making a little bit of meat feed a lot of hungry people. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. When payday was still days away but the family needed something filling and satisfying, Grandma would work her magic with hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. This wasn't fancy food. This was survival cooking elevated to an art form. Ground beef would brown in her biggest skillet, breaking up into small pieces that would catch and hold the gravy that was coming next. Once the beef was perfectly browned, flour would get sprinkled over everything and cooked until it smelled nutty and looked golden. Milk would go in slowly, whisked constantly to prevent lumps, creating a gravy that was rich, creamy, and substantial enough to stick to your ribs. Salt, pepper, and just a touch of garlic powder were all the seasonings this gravy needed, letting the beef flavor shine through in every spoonful. Served over a mountain of fluffy mashed potatoes, this meal was pure comfort food, simple, satisfying, and somehow greater than the sum of its humble parts. Each forkful delivered creamy potatoes and savory gravy in perfect proportion, proving that sometimes the most basic meals are also the most memorable. Beef and mushroom casserole. Grandma's beef and mushroom casserole was her answer to creating something that tasted expensive using ingredients that didn't break the bank. This dish was all about building layers of flavor that would develop and deepen during the slow baking process. Ground beef would brown in her skillet alongside fresh mushrooms that had been sliced thick enough to hold their shape during cooking. The mushrooms would release their earthy juices, mixing with the beef drippings to create a base that was rich and complex. Onions would cook until golden and sweet, adding another layer of flavor to the mix. Everything would get combined with egg noodles and a sauce made from cream of mushroom soup, thinned with just enough milk to make it pour easily. The whole mixture would go into a buttered casserole dish, topped with breadcrumbs that had been tossed with melted butter and grated cheese. As it baked, the top would brown and bubble, while all the flavors underneath melded together into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. Each forkful delivered tender noodles, savory beef, and mushrooms that had absorbed all those wonderful flavors, proving that Grandma knew how to make magic happen in her oven. Old school goulash, American chop suey. Every neighborhood had that one family who made goulash differently, and every family swore their version was the only real way to make it. This wasn't the Hungarian paprika-heavy version that purists might recognize. This was American survival cooking at its finest. Ground beef, elbow macaroni, and whatever vegetables were about to go bad in the icebox. The beauty of goulash was its flexibility. Got some bell peppers that are getting soft? Throw them in. Onions that are sprouting? Perfect. A can of tomatoes that's been sitting in the pantry? Essential. The ground beef was browned first, then everything else joined the party in one big pot. No fancy techniques required, just patience and the wisdom to let everything cook together until the flavors married into something greater than the sum of its parts. Kids loved it because it was basically hamburger and pasta in one bowl. Parents loved it because it used up leftovers and stretched ingredients further than they had any right to go. A pot of goulash could feed the family for 2 days, taste better as leftovers, and cost less than a single restaurant meal today. Chipwreck casserole. The name tells you everything you need to know about this recipe. It was born from desperation and whatever happened to be in the pantry. When grocery money ran out before payday, mothers would survey their kitchens and create miracles from seemingly nothing. Chipwreck casserole became legendary because it combined the irresistible crunch of potato chips with hearty ground beef in a way that made everyone forget they were eating leftovers. Ground beef was stretched with whatever vegetables were available, often canned corn, green beans, or diced tomatoes. The mixture was seasoned with onion soup mix, a pantry staple that added flavor without fresh ingredients, and maybe a can of cream soup to bind everything together. The magic happened on top, where crushed potato chips created a golden, crunchy layer that children would fight over. This dish proved that sometimes the best recipes come from having no choice but to be creative. Families would request it even during better times because it tasted like childhood, like making do, like the satisfaction of turning nothing into something delicious. The name stuck because everyone knew what it meant. Good food made from whatever didn't get wrecked in your kitchen. Beef jambalaya bake. Rice was cheap, filling, and could absorb flavors like nobody's business. When Southern families needed to stretch their ground beef further, they turned to dishes like this beef jambalaya bake that transformed a small amount of meat into a feast. This wasn't authentic Louisiana jambalaya. It was survival cooking that borrowed flavors from wherever they worked. The dish started with browning ground beef and onions, then adding rice, canned tomatoes, and whatever seasonings were available. Paprika gave it color and a hint of smokiness, while garlic powder and cayenne pepper added depth without requiring fresh ingredients. Chicken broth, when available, made the rice extra flavorful, but water worked just fine when money was tight. Everything went into a casserole dish and baked until the rice was tender and had absorbed all the liquid. The result was a complete meal in one dish. Protein, starch, and vegetables all combined into something that tasted exotic and special. Families could eat this for days, and it actually improved with time as the flavors melded together. It was proof that good food didn't require expensive ingredients, just creativity and patience. Hamburger spoonbread casserole. Spoonbread was a Southern tradition that turned cornmeal into something creamy and comforting, almost like a cross between cornbread and pudding. When combined with ground beef, it became a complete meal that could stretch ingredients and fill bellies without breaking the bank. The beef mixture was kept simple: ground beef browned with onions and seasoned with salt, pepper, and maybe a dash of hot sauce for those who liked a little heat. This was layered in a casserole dish and topped with spoonbread batter made from cornmeal, eggs, milk, and a touch of sugar. The beauty was in how the two layers cooked together, with the spoonbread absorbing just enough of the beef juices to stay moist while developing a golden crust on top. The result was comfort food at its finest, creamy, satisfying, and substantial enough to serve as the centerpiece of any meal. Families would gather around the table and scoop portions directly from the casserole dish, the spoonbread holding together just enough to make each bite perfect. It was the kind of dish that made everyone feel taken care of, regardless of what was happening in the world outside. Beef macaroni loaf. Meatloaf was a staple, but when ground beef was especially scarce, creative cooks found ways to stretch it even further. The beef macaroni loaf was one such innovation, combining ground beef with cooked macaroni to create a dish that looked substantial and impressive while using less meat than a traditional meatloaf. The trick was in the binding. Eggs, breadcrumbs, and milk held everything together, while the macaroni added bulk and a different texture that made each slice interesting. Onions were diced fine and mixed throughout, and sometimes a can of tomato sauce was incorporated for extra moisture and flavor. The mixture was shaped into a loaf and baked until firm, then sliced and served with whatever vegetables were available. What made this dish special was how it transformed leftovers into something that felt new and exciting. Leftover macaroni from earlier in the week got a second life, and children who might have complained about eating the same thing twice were fooled into thinking they were getting something completely different. It was economical cooking at its smartest, proving that waste was never acceptable when every ingredient mattered. Beef and cabbage skillet. During the lean months of winter, when fresh vegetables were expensive luxuries, cabbage became the hero of many dinner tables. Cheap, hearty, and able to stretch a small amount of meat into a filling meal, cabbage paired with ground beef created a dish that was both nutritious and satisfying. The process was simple but required timing. Ground beef was browned first, then pushed to one side of a large skillet, while onions cooked in the rendered fat. Cabbage was added in stages, the thick ribs first, then the tender leaves, allowing each piece to wilt and caramelize slightly. Salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of vinegar or a sprinkle of caraway seeds added flavor without adding cost. What made this dish special was how it transformed humble ingredients into something that felt substantial and complete. The cabbage absorbed the beef flavors while contributing its own sweet, slightly tangy taste. Served with boiled potatoes or thick slices of bread, this meal could fill hungry stomachs and provide the energy needed for hard physical work. Many families ate variations of this dish several times a week, never getting tired of it because it tasted like comfort and security. Beef and biscuit ring. Sunday dinners called for something that looked special even when the budget was tight. The beef and biscuit ring solved this problem by taking ordinary ground beef and presenting it in a way that looked like holiday fare. This dish became a favorite because it impressed guests while using ingredients that cost almost nothing. The beef mixture was straightforward: ground beef browned with onions and seasoned with whatever was available. Sometimes cream of mushroom soup was added for richness, or a packet of onion soup mix for extra flavor. The magic was in the presentation. Refrigerated biscuit dough was arranged in a ring around the outside of a round baking dish. Then the beef mixture was spooned into the center. As it baked, the biscuits rose and turned golden brown, creating an impressive crown around the savory filling. When brought to the table, it looked like something from a fancy cookbook, but everyone knew it was just good old-fashioned comfort food dressed up for company. Children loved pulling apart the individual biscuits and dipping them in the beef mixture, making dinner interactive and fun even during the hardest times. Mock Prime Rib Patties. The name was pure marketing genius. Calling anything prime rib made it sound expensive and special, even when it was made from the cheapest cut of meat available. These patties were designed to fool both the eye and the palate, creating the illusion of luxury when there was none to be had. The secret was in the seasoning and presentation. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and a careful blend of spices that included garlic powder, onion powder, and sometimes a touch of soy sauce for that umami richness. The patties were shaped thicker than regular hamburgers and seared in a hot skillet to create a good crust, then finished in the oven to ensure they cooked evenly throughout. What really sold the illusion was the gravy. A rich brown sauce made from the pan drippings that tasted like it came from an expensive roast. Served with mashed potatoes and whatever vegetables were affordable, these patties made families feel like they were dining on the finest cuts of beef. Children grew up thinking their mothers were miracle workers, never knowing that love and creativity were the only expensive ingredients in the recipe. Ketchup glazed meat patties. Ketchup was more than just a condiment. It was a cooking ingredient that could transform simple ground beef patties into something that tasted like they'd been slow cooked for hours. The secret was in creating a glaze that caramelized during cooking, adding both flavor and visual appeal to an otherwise plain dish. The patties themselves were kept simple: ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and basic seasonings, then formed into individual portions. But the magic happened with the glaze, made from ketchup, brown sugar, vinegar, and sometimes a dash of Worcestershire sauce. This mixture was brushed over the patties before cooking and again during the cooking process, building up layers of sweet, tangy flavor. As the patties cooked, the glaze caramelized and created a beautiful mahogany coating that made them look expensive and sophisticated. The flavor was complex, sweet, tangy, and savory all at once, despite being made from ingredients that cost almost nothing. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, these patties could anchor a meal that felt special enough for Sunday dinner while staying within even the tightest budget.